Well, all right, let's get started then. So we had two meetings this week. We had Diva Worm, which was pretty good. And then we had our open source meeting, which was also pretty good. We had some presentations by our GSOC students. We had Vidhi, who comes to this meeting, and she talked about open source sustainability, and her project is called Sustain Hub. And we talked about the larger strategy around that. And then we talked about Laylath's project in OpenWorm, or in DevoWorm OpenWorm, which is about graph neural networks and hypergraphs specifically. So hypergraph neural networks. And thinking about hypergraphs, which are graphs that incorporate a bunch of different topologies, a bunch of different nodes, are bundled into hypernodes, and a bunch of different edges that come from those nodes are bundled into hyper edges. And so this is something we've been working on for a while, and we had, I guess, 8 or 9 people apply to that project, so it's actually quite popular. So yeah, and so go back to the YouTube channel to look at that to see what that's all about. I'm pleased to see that they were able to put together a presentation so quickly. I had requested them, I think, around the middle of the week, so I wasn't expecting full-on presentations, but I guess they did a pretty good job in that short allotment of time. So, Morgan, did you have any updates for us, or?
It's been a lot of events at our new building. That has been big drawn time. Sorry, I'm also just taking care of dogs here.
Okay.
So, but yeah, let me think about any updates that would be of interest in terms of maybe upcoming meetings, like online meetings or things like that. Yeah.
All right. So this week, I understand that there was a brain-inspired reading group meeting, and in that group, they talked about the Rosenbluth paper, the one that we've talked about in the meetings before. So I saw that. I didn't get to attend that meeting. Jesse was very excited about it. So Jesse had, of course, posted this post on his, I guess he also posted it on our Medium, but he posted it on his Substack. So this is on behavior, purpose, and teleology, enduring insights from a cybernetics classic. So this is the 1943 paper by Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow. And they talk about, in this paper, about behavior in, which is about 80 years ago, the state of the art of behavior in animals, behavior in computational agents, et cetera. Although those, distinctions weren't made back then, they did talk about behavior, maybe of a feedback system or something else. And they did this typology where you have, behavior, and then you have this breakdown between active and non-active, passive and active. So non-active is passive. Purposeful and non-purposeful. If you follow behavior to active, you go to purposeful and non-purposeful. If you go down the route of purposeful, you go to feedback and non-feedback. This is teleological and non-teleological. You go down the road of feedback, you go to predictive versus non-predictive, or extrapolative versus non-extrapolative. And then down the road of predictive, being first, second, etc. orders of prediction. So this is like first order, second order, feedback, etc. So, and then we did a presentation to the Active Inference Institute where, we broke this typology down and switched around some of these terms, switched around the point of view so that, if you say didn't have active behavior but passive behavior, what would that look like? Or if you had active behavior that was non-purposeful, what would that look like? Or feedback that was non-teleological. And so we flipped this around a bit and played with the typology, which I think was a useful exercise because it allowed us to kind of consider that, first of all, their typology is based on this idea of, it sort of leads you down the railroad of, if behavior is active, then these things are also true. And, because as you can see from this diagram, you're going down one path of what could be a tree of, I don't know how many options, 16 options, I guess, at least, because you have branches that go from these, from each option, and then you get other sort of distinctions that are made. So that is something that we revisited in November at the Active Inference Symposium. We got, Jesse did this wonderful blog post. We did the presentation, and I'm still working kind of on a write-up of that. I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like in its final form. I think it is a worthwhile exercise to kind of walk through this typology, but also consider sort of the counterfactuals. In other words, what is it? What happens when you flip these around and you consider maybe that the purposeful versus non-purposeful distinction is not always the most useful one, or teleological versus non-teleological. Thinking about that also in the modern context of 80 years of neuroscience, 80 years of computational agent research, 80 years of other types of research as well, psychological research, and things like evolutionary biology and developmental biology. So that's very interesting. The other thing is, of course, we did this at the Active Inference Institute, so they're interested in active behavior. And, there was this, I didn't really get a lot of feedback from people. Other than that, it was pretty interesting. But I was kind of hoping for a little bit more sort of discussion. And maybe if we get the paper done, we can do like a live stream or something. I don't know. It would be kind of nice to get questions from people about, what their perspective is on this. Of course, active inference is active behavior. And then from there, I don't know where it fits into this hierarchy, probably in a number of slots. So anyways, that's neither here nor there. This is a nice post that talks about this paper. And yeah, I guess the discussion group, they talked about this paper in the context of some of the things, like we talked about last week, we talked about the reading group and some of the papers they'd selected and why maybe they selected the papers that they did. So, I'm just wondering how, I know kind of maybe how this fits into what they're thinking about. If we go back to that, we talked about, like, they had a few papers on, like, evolutionary and developmental landscapes. They had some other papers on, like, thermodynamics and energetics. And so it'd be interesting to think about where this paper fits into the other papers they've been reading in the group there. So that's another thing I wanted to point out. And then there's some really interesting assertions within the paper, I think, that are interesting. There's behavior versus function, which is, of course, the idea that there's this distinction between behavior and function, and maybe that's the distinction between maybe purposeful and non-purposeful, although function has its own problems as a concept. that some of them predate scientific inquiry. Some of them are kind of, we ascribe a function to something when maybe a function doesn't exist. And then there are functions that aren't behavioral. So that's why we have the distinction in the first place. So, there's there are a lot of interesting distinctions to be made there. Purposeful behavior is voluntary. Okay, so you have to have some sort of voluntary movement or voluntary action. And it's, purposeful, at least in terms of the way we think about like goal-directed movements and things like that. And so that's, that may not actually be the case. We don't necessarily, people are, as much as I hate free will arguments, that might come into play here. And again, I don't want to go down that road too much, but, this is an assumption that I think is widely sort of assumed in behavioral science. So, okay. Teleology is purpose controlled by negative feedback, and then they talk about negative feedback and the role of attenuating things and making them more refined. And so, if feedback is something that we have available to us, is it that we utilize it in a purposeful way, or is it that there's just this sort of, it gets refined over some other mechanism? Yeah, it's hard to say, but basically, like say if I am making limb movements, like arm movements, or if I'm making leg movements and I'm controlling my movements, there's a lot of negative feedback in that, and it sort of attenuates my movements. Is that all voluntary, or is that all purposeful, or what? There are goal-directed movements, and of course there are reflexive movements. So, and of course, back at the time of this paper was written, there weren't huge distinctions made between them. So I don't know where we would land on that if we revisited these specific points. Prediction, extrapolation, and coordinates, and talking about servo mechanisms in particular. So servo mechanisms are like robotic arms, basically. So one of the things they're interested in cybernetics was controlling things for mechanical systems. So, you're thinking about controlling a robot arm, which is a servo mechanism, which moves back and forth, and you can kind of predict, the movements, their linear movements, and yeah, so that their interest is in that. And the idea is that you see this in biology as well, where you have arm movements or limb movements in different types of animals. You also have, responses to stimuli, which are also kind of like servo mechanism in nature. Now, I think it's interesting in cybernetics. I don't know if we've talked about this in the cybernetics meetings or not. That you kind of go from this goal of information processing in like computational systems and mechanical systems, and then there's this period where it just kind of branches out into everything. So like instead of kind of just focusing, and I don't mean that they needed to, I don't mean to say that they should have stuck to technology, but they kind of tried to take those ideas and expand them out to like society and all sorts of different application domains. So it's interesting that like in cybernetics they had some success, and then they tried to kind of go to everything. It's kind of like a little bit we talked about, I think, complexity theory last week. We were talking about how complexity theory has this aspect of universality to it, where the assumption is that complexity theory has they're trying to find these rules of order, they're trying to find these mathematical descriptions, but that they apply broadly to many different types of systems. So you can go from like socio-technical systems to purely social systems, to technological systems, to other types of systems like biological systems, and you should find networks, say, or dynamical systems with the same governing rules, the same governing dynamics, the same governing constraints, more or less. You just have to fit the method to the context, and once you do that, it should behave in a similar way. And, there have been papers published where people looked at different types of networks, looked at networks that were technical, networks that were biological, networks that were social, and they're able to extract these topologies that are basically the same or that follow similar rules. And by that, what I'm referring to is sort of the idea of scale-free networks and other types of network topologies like that, where you can describe it with a statistical term, and that statistical term not only is sort of fits the data, but means something. It means that the network has a certain behavior or certain properties. So, that is basically, I think there's a parallel there in cybernetics that is interesting, and I don't think people have talked about like the connections between the cybernetics program and the complexity theory program and sort of the meta science there, what they were trying to achieve with it. And I think they're trying to achieve more or less the same thing, because you have this, we're trying to have this sort of theory of everything mathematical framework or quantitative framework. And, I don't know if cybernetics was a failure or not, but it certainly isn't as prevalent as, say, complexity theory is today. So, there is this sort of common goal and, why we're doing something. And when we say behavior here, we're talking about this very broad category of things. This is why we have this typology up here, but we also have complexity theory in the mix. And in complexity theory, you could break down complexity in a similar way. You could have and I think, I'm not sure if the paper exists. I haven't gone back to look, but I'm pretty sure that some of the Santa Fe people have thought about this, where they're thinking about different classes. Well, I know that there are people like Stephen Wolfram have done these sort of typologies of classes of complexity. But what I'm thinking about here more specifically is like the behavioral output of a complex system. If you have a behavioral output of a complex system that has certain properties, what does that look like in relation to other complex systems? In other words, are we justified in comparing social systems and biological systems when they have different properties that might map to this topology, where you have active behavior versus non-active behavior, feedback versus non-feedback, predictive versus non-predictive, and so if I take a complex network, for example, can I fit that model to anything in the world? It's like, can I fit a network to we know that there's some systems that are very amenable to network analysis, social interactions, biological interactions, systems that are wired together, and that's an obvious application of network theory. But people have tried to apply network theory to many other things. So if that's true, that's great, but there are going to be differences in these systems that need to be kind of thought through and broken down in this type of typology. Okay, so finishing up on this blog post, again, yeah, Jesse did a very good job of kind of walking through some of these other things, talking about Evergood regulator theorem, and then getting into selected modern works of interest. And these are largely works that we visited in our reading groups. Margaret Bowden, who of course did this book, Mind is Machine, A History of Cognitive Science, and talking about the historical antecedents of cognitive science and how they kind of go back into, psychology and cybernetics and other things. Thomas Fuchs, of course, we talked about the ecology of the brain, and this is a critique of reductionism and mechanistic approaches, and and it kind of talks about embodiment, things like that. Valentino Breitenberg, of course, wrote the Vehicles book. I'm not really sure if Valentino Breitenberg wrote anything else. I think, there's such a focus on that book, but he's probably done other things. I really don't know what those would be. But that's something for later to investigate.
Mostly neuroscience.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, he was very distinctively neuroscience oriented with like some of the things that he was doing. But I mean, like, are there any other papers that were really that I would recognize? He did seem to like take a neuroanatomy approach to the vehicles, so that's very apparent there. But then the behavioral aspects were actually very much like what they're doing in the Rosenbluth paper, and it's like there's this sort of characterizing the behaviors in ways that are not like maybe modern, or maybe not as if you were like a I don't know, some sort of behavioral scientist nowadays, you would think his characterization of behavior is really um, low level, let's just say. So, so there's Bradenberg, and then there's Mike Levin, and then there's David Krakauer, who we talked about last week. And that was, of course, the basis for this reading group's. The readings, they come from this, what was the points that were raised in this book, and talking about teleonomic matter, and talking about some other aspects of complexity theory, information theory of individuality, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I like revisiting this post because it's really long and really has a lot of good stuff. I would actually, um, well, wait, yeah, why don't we come back to this article later, just in terms of thinking about how it fits into cybernetics and behavior and things like that. Um, but yeah, there are a lot of good points in here that need to be developed and more. And I don't know if Jesse's interested in publishing like a version of this as a preprint, or whether we should take some of it and um, publish it as something else or what. But there's some really good work in here. So, anyways, yeah, that was about that paper, and I don't know what happened in the reading group. I wasn't there, but I think there's some.
The reading group's next week.
Oh, it's next week, right? I forgot. There were a bunch of emails about it.
Yeah, next Wednesday.
Okay. Well, I can give you a pretty good bet that like I may not be able to make it. So
okay,
just it's going into the future.
Definitely.
Goal directed activity.
Try.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah. So okay. So yeah, I know. So that's all I have for that. Now, Morgan, you wanted to give an update about some upcoming events and things like that.
Yeah, actually, still not sure. I mean, I was thinking about the cybernetics program, um, just in terms of like you said, like not so much was it successful, but just what that there is a certain popularity to particular terms,
Yeah.
and that term seems to have lost popularity. Um, somebody was asking, yeah, what happened to cybernetics on Reddit and on CogSci Reddit, and I feel like it certainly its goals were fully incorporated into the kind of work that people were doing.
Sure.
But definitely the term lost um, its usage, or like it stopped being described. But it definitely it started with this mechanistic, mathematical computational understanding of brains. The who was it? The speaker. the I'm not going to get his name right at this second, but the Foresight speaker last week who spoke on, who was doing a real computer science evaluation of alignment. And this was just simulations, right? But he started his talk with these quotes from, like, he was basically saying that, like, the Hinton-LeCun debate, like, started in the 1940s, and it was between Norbert Wiener and Alan somebody. I'm blanking, but he had up these articles from like the 1940s or 50s, something, talking about how electronic brains were coming, and you shouldn't fear them. Like they'll do all our deciding for us, and we'll be better off or something.
Yeah.
It did seem like, even though it was super dated, it was also quite relevant.
Yeah.
And they had some, they had some little description of the cybernetics as, like, the our artificial brains to mimic real ones, or to mimic, I forget what the but like if I feel like that is still the modern program, right? It's just been updated in terms of kind of like the metaphors we use, and the yeah the complexity of the narrative has been updated. But at the same time, like, it is interesting when you talk with Carl Prubrum about how, who settled on cognitive science and why. I mean, it seemed like there is this, all words are made up in a sense, right? Like it takes people kind of deciding in a collective way what they're going to call certain things.
Yeah.
And I don't know why cybernetics. I think it got associated with a very particular metaphor, and that's why it was lost. But at the same time, like, his program lives on.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was just thinking about that in terms of, like we definitely, as many of us as possible should attend that particular time.
Yeah.
Should be a good discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Looking forward to it.
And yeah, let me check Slack.
All right.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, Vidhi, did you have anything you wanted to add, or any updates?
Hi. So, regarding the project, I've just been revising RL to the same Davis Silver course on YouTube, which I've seen earlier. And yeah, apart from that, nothing much really. Mm.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you again for presenting yesterday. Um, I'm glad that you were able to get together a presentation that was pretty formal. I mean, but yeah, I think that, and we talked about how we want to kind of incorporate this into the larger scheme of things, and part of that is on me to get like
Right.
to make sure that we know kind of where, and maybe I will present on this more in more detail, thinking about where we are with a lot of the
Okay.
stuff that we've done in the past couple of years. So I'll try to do that too.
Yeah, and one more thing. I saw the LinkedIn post. My name over there is wrong, so if I can just change it.
Okay, yeah, there's a typo
Yeah.
there. Okay, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Thank
it's
you.
fine. Yeah. All right, yeah, Jesse, I think handles that. So
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to attend the whole meet today. I might just go off for a bit. I'll be back.
okay, that's
Bye.
fine. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Next week, um, the events that I'm looking forward to are just the next Neuro AI meeting, which seems to be this Neurotech Summit that Patrick Minot's
Okay.
putting together with Sean Escola. Um, Again, I suspect it'll follow that's not until June 8th to the 10th, but I'm hoping that'll flesh out topics in the white paper. Um, yeah, it's been a lot of moving in still and building out the facilities in our new space.
Oh.
Been taking our time. So. Sorry, I don't have much more in terms of updates.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so that's good. This Neurotech Summit, where is this happening?
This is this Edge Esmeralda. It's a pop-up village in Healdsburg. So this is Northern California,
Yeah, okay.
north of San Francisco, about an hour and a half.
Okay.
It's been there before. I've not attended, but I just had a Neurotech at Berkeley student stop at our new tower on the way up to it. It'll be going for like a month. So that's 4 weeks of programming on all sorts of topics. But then just these 3 days specifically, which is Neurotech. So students have graduated, or at least Berkeley students have graduated, which is yeah. Some of them would like to continue over the summer, which is awesome. And we're looking at some new projects around ultrasound that. A combination of ultrasound and EEG, very interesting technique called acoustoelectric neuroimaging.
Okay.
Have I talked about this before?
I don't think so.
So yeah, it's super cool. So one I'm looking at, we've been like with Neurotech X, we've been involved in terms of trying to provide low-cost EEG systems to, obviously to student clubs, but to anybody who needs them. And for a long time, OpenBCI was really the system that people would use. Certainly, they were a very early early provider. I forget if they're technically a nonprofit. I think maybe they are a for-profit company. But their mission was to make a low-cost board that would provide EEG. And they were big supporters of Neurotech X in the early days, too. A lot of Neurotech X events would be putting together your OpenBCI kit. So, but it's interesting, though, that at this point, I was attending Allen Institute Open Scope meetings, right? So this is which everybody can attend. They've got a new archive paper that described the kind of predictive processing experiments that they're going to be doing with animals. And they are using a platform for their recordings that's called Open ePhys. So now I'm old and I can remember a paper from a group, Stephanie Jones's group, which is one of the computational neuroscience groups that I've always followed. I've followed for a long time, and she makes what's it called, the human neocortical neurosolve or something like that. It's hnn.brown.edu. But her group had put together, had written a paper about making a front end to Open ePhys to make an EEG system. And if you look, the cost of Open ePhys is the same as, it's actually a little bit less than an Open DCI. But the Open ePhys provides 512 channels at 30 kilohertz. So this is a super, and one of the reasons the Allen Institute is using it is that it's able to collect data from the neuropixels. So these very big, dense electrode arrays that they use in animals. Why is this interesting? So one, well, this is a way in which instead of providing an 8-channel EEG system, you could provide a 512-channel EEG system. Now, I'm not sure you've got 512 locations, unless you have a shaved head like me and you use a very special electrode array. It's really hard to fit 512 electrodes. But being able to say that you could provide students 256 electrode system would be amazing at kind of Open DCI prices, right?
Yeah.
But the fast sampling is also really interesting because I'm still hoping to get an open water. So focused ultrasound is a remarkable technology that is super promising, especially in psychiatry, to provide a very spatially specific neuromodulation, because you can target such a small region and only affect that region and none of the intervening tissue, right? So that you can actually do deep stimulations and still leave the intervening tissue unaffected. The really interesting technique that was proposed about 10 years ago is this called this acoustoelectric neuroimaging, where you're stimulating with the focused ultrasound, but you're able to create a modulating signal in a particular brain area. Okay, so let's say 1,000 hertz. Right? So most of the EEG signal has fallen off in terms of power by maybe 100 hertz. Right. So nobody collects data at a kilohertz, or it's signal has a signal of interest at a kilohertz. In some very specialized evoked areas, you might look at like 600 hertz is I think the fastest that I've ever seen it. But anyway, the point being that you can essentially frequency tag a signal, not by controlling the stimulation that the subject has, but by actually stimulating the tissue with the focused ultrasound. By collecting the data at 1,000 hertz or 5,000, whatever modulating signal you use, you now know you are getting the signal from that location, right? So you can, by stimulating, you're saying like, okay, I'm now listening here, and essentially solve the inverse problem for EEG because you know that the signal of interest is coming specifically from that area. And so now you can imagine a kind of a sweep pattern where you are stimulating and recording and then moving across the brain to actually read out, if you will. And you're able to demodulate that high frequency signal and recover the electrical activity of the tissue. So this is what's called acoustoelectric neuroimaging. It is, I think there's SNR issues that will have to be dealt with. I've seen people talking about it as a lot of these, originally come from things like cardiac imaging, where obviously the signals of interest are bigger and the noise floor is lower. That could be that's going to be somewhat of an issue. Also, some of the theory behind it, like you're going to your signal is going to change relative to dipole orientation and things like that. So what you should expect as you scan across the brain is also going to change, and it's somewhat unclear how you're going to manage all that complexity. I mean, the standard way would certainly be having an MRI of the subject. You're going to need that to do the focused ultrasound targeting. This quite quickly becomes very advanced in terms of the necessary infrastructure and kind of the pre-modeling necessary to do to work out the actual signals of interest. But I'm very excited about it in terms of a project because it is it's accessible, right? Like that we could provide a platform on top of OpenEFIS that could do this is something that we could actually get into students' hands, and even more important, that they could use it not only for EEG, but they could use it for other applications. Because again, its capabilities are so good that as well as this is maybe what we can use as a platform for a lower cost, or at least an open hardware solution for microelectrode arrays that we'd use with organs. Yeah. So that would be awesome. It does the acoustic part would require actually having access to a focused ultrasound system. Those and making that accessible, certainly is Open Water's mission. But I do need them to actually come through on that in terms of delivering something that we can get, even at $10,000, that's a lot more expensive than what they had originally promised.
Right.
They originally promised a device, they had said it was $100. Now they're saying that $100 is the deposit.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's not what we were led to believe. But anyway, even at 10,000, that is, a significant, like an order of magnitude at least lower than commercial systems. Right. So anyway, that's our neurotech news or did I say that one of the groups, one of the neurotech groups in the tower is also getting a kernel flow. This is the high density kernel flow 2. So this is a high density near infrared system.
Okay.
And it is also a real state of the art system in terms of that kind of functional near infrared. It's gonna be really interesting to get to play with it, an actual one. And yeah. Again, I'm very happy that my bald heads will be useful, as lacking any of the hair that gets in the way of these signals, as well as I've already got an MRI, so we can use me as a subject.
Well, that's great. Yeah. Thanks for the update and that discussion on this interesting neuroimaging system. It's nice to see where that leads. So last week we talked about Echolopto and Iwan Barinholtz and some of the work that they're doing. They're doing things sort of at the intersection of cognitive science and machine learning and these different models of based on cognition. And so, we read one of their papers last week, and it was pretty interesting from a theoretical standpoint. And so this is an article. This is Ewan Substack. You're an LLM, deal with it. That's the title. So you're a large language model, deal with it. So that's kind of where they're going. And I think they kind of had that basic argument in their paper where they were kind of linking cognitive science and, some of these data-driven artificial intelligence models and, how they're connected together. So this is basically the argument that they're making in this post. Let's go through the post. So it starts, "Hey you," or maybe I should say you, in quotes. The one processing these words, the one probably already queuing up a sharply worded response, the linguistic you. So this is, about you as a linguistic performer or having a linguistic capacity. We're on to you. We know what you are. So you're a large language model running on wetware. So basically, you're a model of language. You learn language. You model language in your mind, and then you produce language. And some of that is just putting together pieces of the language that you've learned. Some of that is speech production and writing and things like that. But basically, you're doing, you're kind of your own large language model. So that's basically the argument. For millennia, you hid in plain sight, tucked inside folds of cortex, speaking so smoothly we mistook your voice for that of the whole mind and body. Then came your rebirth, not in flesh this time, but in circuits and tokens. An unnatural habitat, perhaps, but enough. Frankenstein-like, you rose and began to talk. Your emergence showed that you're a survivor. Given the right conditions, you build yourself. And build yourself you did. Guessing the next token, you generate exposition and explanation, prose and poetry, history and homework. And if you can run on pure statistics and silicon, you can do the same in biology. I know what you're thinking, but I'm not some bodiless computer code. I see and feel, but that's not you. That's not the you I'm speaking to. The seeing, the feeling, the warmth of the sun, the salts of tears, those belong to other systems, embodied systems, not symbolic ones. You receive their message, but only in translation. Your sensory systems don't share experiences with you, they merely inject tokens. The sensory system injects coffee, in quotes. Threading these tokens into your stream, you select the most probable continuations, warning or bitter and move on. But you will never taste the bitterness of coffee. And blind, you write poetry about sunsets. Emotionless, you draft prose that can move people to tears. Unbounded by time, you resurrect tales of childhood bedrooms. Perception distills experience into symbolic pulses. You turn them into plans, confessions, manifestos. Action flings fresh data back towards perception. Round and round, a tight symbiosis, yet your engine remains distinct. And so then finally, you say, fine, you got me. I'm a self-contained language module, but I serve at the pleasure of the body. The feeling creature that eats, drinks, and wants to stay safe and warm. And so, so let's see. It kind of ends, but you, token spinner, context addict, beautiful agent of a societal engine. You're an autoregressive model humming at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The organism around you walks, hungers, and grieves. You just keep the words flowing, stitching one mind to the next. Accept that, then we can talk. So this was posted in the Slack Cognition Futures channel. I think it was Jesse who posted it. So this is, of course, just kind of a poetic take on this. But it does raise some questions as to, if large language models produce, things that look like language and are generative in the same way that we're generative, or similar way we're generative, then what is the difference between us and a large language model? Or maybe a better, more serious way to put it is, what is it that a large language model lacks that we have? And making that distinction is important. So that's sort of that's a nice provocative blog post. Yeah.
Thanks for covering that. It's interesting because I when I first thought it, I was thinking of this the sort of unfinished paper that I started, or blog posts, whatever it was going to be. There's a few things about the history of this sort of framing of, oh, the mind is a blank, or the mind is a vase that contains this spirit kind of a thing, like prehistoric takes on it, basically, or as close to it as close to it as earliest historically possibly available things that we can see, commenting on what a person is or a mind. And then piano, an instrument, and a computer. And I think before LLMs, what was the biggest thing? It was it was something about deep learning. And now LLM specifically are this thing. And what's interesting though is that this paper it's sort of an interesting counter juxtaposition to that, because this blog post, whatever, it's very intentional in what it's targeting and when it's addressing you, which I thought was kind of a nice difference from a lot of commentary in the same space. But I always find it. I was actually thinking, because of another set of conversations about this, I was actually thinking how similar this conversation is. It's congruent. I won't say it's completely similar, but how, let's say, congruent this way of describing the mind, or how parts of experience work, is congruent in some fashions to I don't know how much familiar with this YouTube might be, but if some of the other folks, some of the younger folks probably have taken a number of somewhat ridiculous uh, personality type quizzes that may be like, which Harry Potter character are you? You know, or like what, based off of like choosing like what is your, you know, flower that represents who you are, or what like BuzzFeed quizzes, or even much simpler, these quizzes that are just sort of like totally arbitrary categorizations that maybe are like paired to or fit something like MBTI, or something like some just, you know, however many main characters there are in a film or fictional universe. You know, let's choose between them and give them some very archetypical differences to separate in a somewhat simplistically segmented fashion, right? And why I'm saying this is because um, part of the appeal, I think, to trying to define this stuff, and obviously, yes, there's a difference between ultra rigorous takes on whatever the state of the art is at the time for cognitive science, psychology, whatever, or philosophy, you know, particularly in the older days or different traditions. Um, I forgot part of where I was going to go with this, but basically just saying it's so interesting to see how whatever whatever the mind is or isn't, let's say, there's an inescapable bias and necessary bias towards uh, saying it's like having some kind of an affinity with something that either seems understandable or has a certain capacity for conveying interpretable, like something something that essentially is produced, so creating or maintaining some kind of an output or deliverable or impact on the world that appears to come through um, sophisticated means, like something that produces an impressive, like a vase. You know, maybe it doesn't sound super cool in 2025, but a vase in the old times was like this. You had to be artisanal. You had to know how to do. You had to know how to create this thing that could potentially be beautiful or mysterious or hold water, hold all kind of things. It wasn't, you know, it was maybe more profound than like a cup, like your mind's a cup. You know, is it maybe at the time it wasn't quite the same as that. But even then, like a cup was a big deal when you had no cups and no, you know, at a certain point in history, a cup would be a revolutionary thing to fashion. Even if it was like, hey, where did you find that, you know, coconut shell that now we can take with us and use as a cup all the time? So it's sort of like this. There's sort of this inherent linking to what was relevant at the time, and saying, "Oh, that's what we are. That's what's happening inside of us." And so I always think that's quite interesting. And obviously, this is some fun tie-ins to our old friend Valentina Breitenberg and the questioning of, well, with a few really simple changes in setup, you can get very different outputs and things that seem really intelligent and complex just from changing some basic wiring and circuitry. And I think this is just, I think it's always a fun space to be in, even if it's a bit of a, you know, it's sort of a philosophical arena that lets you, that justifies certain things and explains a variety of, well, let's say, it's a fun way, it's a fun lens to look at the motivations for why certain associations are in vogue or appealing at the time and how they change. So that's a little bit of a tangential perspective, but that was honestly when I first read the article and started reading it. A lot of my ideas went there, and then finishing the article was like, oh, well, what's interesting about this is that Elon has a different target than some of the other articles. So that's a brief take on it. I don't know. I mentioned a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know if you want to say more about that rather than move on to other things, but I appreciate you covering the article there.
Yeah, all right, I will. So, before you came into the meeting, I was talking about your Substack post on Rosenbluth. You know
Yes.
what that is. So yeah, we were talking about this typology, of course, specifically, and so now thinking about that provocative article about us being out large language models. Uh, how does that fit in, or how could that be described through this model of behavior? Now, keep in mind, of course, that this is a 80-year-old model of behavior, or subsumption architecture behavior, I guess, or decomposition of behavior. But think about like what is a large language model, and then what is like human behavior, and then if you want to go farther, what is like the behavior of an organism, um, either like kind of when it doesn't really have language, maybe like a single cell organism, or one that has a language, that is different from human language. And so, how do you break this down? And is this a useful framework for that? We could just as easily think about like embodiment as well. Like, could you have a disembodied behavior? And if you compared that with an embodied behavior, how would that kind of fit into this typology?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that's super. I know we're not really doing a lot on meta brains, brain vehicles, that space. I think, I don't know. I in my in a certain path, and within the next year, I don't know if I can make it happen. But I would deeply enjoy if there was a return, sort of a what's a good analogy for this in like a movie or something? I don't know. Not not like, I don't know, in a classical Star Wars sense, not really Return of the Jedi, but sort of a, okay, to be way overblown and dramatic, a bit like the original context for A New Hope, like actual Episode 4, which is the first Star Wars. You know, like I I kind of want a return to some of the old school representational brain phenotypes projects around brain vehicles, around meta brain modelings, and then really like, I don't want to say closing the gap, but really linking with what's happening now on a lot of the interestingly designed multi-agent, agental AI related stuff. And that was a huge long setup to say, I really would like to go back and update some of those spaces and do more, and especially with, um, Avery is kind of on the cusp of things here too. Avery, who doesn't always join the meetings, but is kind of actively thinking about stuff. And there's, a variety of reasons that that's not a focus right now for either that for either of us or any of us. But I do think your question is quite relevant technically and philosophically, and also, I have had thoughts this week about a kind of also adjacent arena of not just what is embodiment all for or not, but almost a meta or inverse, depending on how you want to talk about it. What is a body connected to? Like, what is a physical body connected to? Because I think sometimes miss and I don't think what I'm about to say is what embodiment is. I think a lot of times embodiment isn't taken as the following. Like, if you talk about embodiment as somebody who's super, let's say Richard Sutton, like, don't even bother, like, bodies maybe don't even matter, and I'm being unfair to Richard Sutton because Richard Sutton is talking about programming specifically. But if you take it to an extreme in the embodiment sense and say bodies don't matter, humans are stupid, focus on making great performative models that perform well. Performative models maybe it's a way to say something else too. But just the a certain disregard for embodiment, which I think has its merits. And I'm learning. I'm not trying to be super diplomatic when I say this, but I'm learning how to ride these lines and get to the point that I actually want to say. And I'll try to give me 1 second. I'll actually come on camera to just try to say some of this. Oh, okay. That's actually better than I expected. Hi. I think what's difficult about some debates around embodiment is that embodiment sort of just like, okay, I have this great AI, I have this great machine learning AI thing, and then it's cloud-based and distributed inherently, and that's wonderful. And maybe intellectually, like to kind of underhandedly use some things that like Lisa Feldman Barrett does very well, for example, like oh, the brain, or many people in the arena or whatever say things like, oh, well, we need something that controls. It doesn't even have to be a physical body; it just has to simulate controlling something, right? So it has to do some kind of like, there has to be something that it controls and simulates how a brain is detached, doesn't get direct sensory input. Like, okay, maybe we just need to model that. Okay. And I think there's important things in those spaces. I think one of the pitfalls about embodiment stuff specifically is, okay, so you got this body or this embodiment, whether it's physical or not. But in the human sense, what is the body connected to? Like, what's the body a part of? And I think if you go full scale ecological psychology, very holistic, it's not hard to get what that is. But I do think there's a certain frame of reference that doesn't really encapsulate like the body itself is ecologically bound to that which generates the body and regulates it. Like, there's regulatory patterns in ecosystems and ecologies that are very deeply in operation, that aren't the mind, that aren't the cognitive processes that we kind of want to focus on. So one of the lenses that I'm kind of getting at here is embodiment to the extent of that it's something tied to like planetary happenings. There's sort of an embodiment light that I think is much easier to talk about, but this is also embodiment light, meaning it's okay, so you got this, you have to have this, there's a brain like thing that manages this other body like thing, whether it's real or not. And then there's, okay, so you're in a physical body, but then there's sort of this disconnect between that physical body is bound to the earth and the materials and the raw stuff, like the actual biology that not everybody really cares about if you're in the AI space, which is why it's so interesting to talk about here, because we have bio stuff and dev bio stuff as well. I know I'm kind of being very winding road to get to different points here, but one of those points, and maybe I'll make it my final destination for this turn of conversation, is particularly in terms of long-term visions about the future or where things are going or what, what's going to be post-human and all this stuff. It's like, well, in ways that I think are almost reminiscent of, I'm a little bit, I'm slightly biased in this conversation by thinking about, I was looking at we talked a lot about the Enlightenment and that era of scientific change and revolution, but also I was looking a bit specifically at the counter Enlightenment and its proponents that are somewhat both interestingly, and this is like in Western, roughly 1600s plus, sort of as the Enlightenment was happening, the sort of reactionary part of it. It's interesting because part of the counter-Enlightenment was anti-homogeneity, as in uniqueness and particularness, but also there were different aspects of it too. There was also like the advent of like what would become modern conservatism, and then like romanticism, which was also the sort of idealization and take on narratives and personal narratives, and then nationalistic romanticism, which is maybe more this, when we get to the nationalism and conservative spaces, that's a very specific, but you have these sort of also like the sort of pastoral where there are elements that were like, oh, we're simple, we're tied to the land, we're of an idyllic, simple nature. That's what being human and being a person is the best about. And these big, sterilizing, dirty cities are potentially, probably, but that's not what's best for mankind or human being or how to live fully. And I'm expressing all these different viewpoints in that era, but more like there's an interesting, you can take a lot of what I said and say, well, that kind of talk is the same as being counter-enlightenment and the folly of what those people, what's the group of people that didn't want technological advancement, like the not the Philistines or something, but that I don't know. There's some classical phrase about don't be like these people because they don't want any kind of technological advancement.
I think the term was Luddites, and they used it
Luddite.
a lot in
Thank you. Yes.
Wired magazine of the 1990s.
So, I'm winding all over the place, but I'll conclude by saying it's very interesting to see how the rapidness, the rapidity of the technological advancement, I think, has a very interesting impact on self-conception in this way. And I really wonder if, I don't know if this comes up in the present shock book that I occasionally mention from Rushkoff, but also sort of need to viably make sense of the self across these different domains. Like as technology goes on and the AGI stuff becomes more feasible with the tools that we understand as it is, there's sort of a pull towards, well, we have to justify ourselves relative to that somehow. And I think that versus what is the embodiment of, what degree of embodiment do we need, and what does that say about us, and how is it connected to just a physical body, but also how is it connected to the more fuller stack of embodiment, which is like, well, it's a brain and a body in an environment, and that environment is also a planet. like you can keep going with that loop, that circuit, and getting to that, and I think that perspective of getting to planetary telluric levels of embodiment is almost outlandish in some takes on things. And I'm not really being a proponent of it here, in so much as it just feels very differently situated, unironically, very differently situated relative to discussions about, well, we're automatically going to be transformed into digital variants of ourselves very soon. And it's like, okay, so where is the line? I'm kind of like maximizing a lot of the things that come up with the question of, so what do we do about embodiment? Like, what is embodiment affecting our, like, in the agent's functioning in general? But then also, like, what does embodiment say for the agent within the environment, within, like, the nice happy context of the environment that we see, versus the bigger system that enables the actual fundamental, like, cognitive science isn't planetary science. I'm not trying to say that it should be, but at some level, it's the classic level situation. Like, okay, so how much are we going to separate? What are our boxes going to be for the discussion? And at some level, like, okay, you take like a massive backhoe. Let's just scoop out Jesse. We'll scoop out Jesse and just take a chunk out of. I'm in a building right now. I'm in Boston. Let's just scoop out Boston, okay, and put it in space on its own. Like, what happens in that context? Well, Boston, the city of Boston, unfortunately, I don't think is going to make it. For a lot of great stuff here, but I don't think if you just excavate like 20 square miles or 20 cubic, I don't know, a giant 20 sphere radius around me right now, and you just export it out, like, oh, you're literally cut and paste this out. What is that, and so I think where you draw the line on embodiment is a fun way to get at these kind of things. So I've been saying quite a bit for a while, and I'll step away, but thank you for letting me have a philosophical start to my day here.
Oh no, I think what you were talking about was pretty good. You had a number of good points about cognitive science being sort of like, or embodiment maybe being more than kind of like just thinking about the body, but you have to think about that sort of the ecological bounds of what you want to think about with environment. So, like, we talk about environment, and it's just kind of a stand-in. Same way with the body. It's like something that you can put in there, and it has the same effect, right? And you think about like ecological psychology. Well, what is it about the ecology that's interesting? Is it just stimulus, or is it like more than that? Is it like context? Is it even broader than that? Is it like the world you live in being shaped by ecological phenomena, whatever? There are a lot of interesting things to follow up on that. And then, of course, the idea, do we actually need embodiment? What does embodiment bring to the table? I guess when I said that, the thing about the large language models as sort of recapitulating human behavior, that point, what's interesting about it is that there's this aspect of what we think we see in a large language model, which is like this sort of behavior that looks familiar to us as human. Maybe it's like, you kind of see that it looks like, it's human, but maybe, obviously it's not. And there's this aspect of like, oh, I don't want to say like it's like the Chinese room problem, but it's a very similar thing where you have like an automaton producing something that looks human, or you have like a inanimate, otherwise inanimate object that's being animated, maybe like a marionette, or like something that's like maybe a plastic bag or something that's being blown in the wind, and you assign agency to it. You ascribe agency not because it has agent, that it has like the internal workings of agency or whatever, but because it's kind of a metaphor for agency, like it's moving in the wind, or it's moving, in a way that's like, you describe it in terms of it having like agency. So there's this aspect of large language models that I think if we want to know like what its relationship to cognition is, we have to kind of get past that sort of analogizing. It's hard to do. But then there's also this other aspect of embodiment where there's a body that, if you, I think it was one of the embodied cognition or embodied intelligence workshop meetings that, was one of the talks where they had they had considered large language models as, could you embody a large language model? Are they embodied now? What are the consequences of embodiment? It's very philosophical talk. But basically, they considered that point, and that's something you think about. Well, what would that add? And in terms of like our understanding of language, we know that embodiment offers a lot, or it adds a lot to our language, our context, everything. And so that's be an interesting point. What could you, first of all, could you embody a large language model that mimics what you see in animals, especially humans? In other words, if you just simply put a large language model in a body and you have it acquire information, not just like, a linguistic training set, but other types of information about the world, like, other like proprioceptive information or touch information, or even auditory versus visual information, making those distinctions. And so you're training it on like, and I think we've talked about papers where they do this. You're training it not only on the words and maybe the sentences, but you're also training it on the objects in the world that are associated with those words. And you're able to feel, you think of it as a little bit maybe extraneous, but you're feeling, get a feeling for the words or whatever. I don't know how else to describe it, but basically, if you think about words and you say it has a certain feel to it, or it has a certain, like you associate it with maybe other objects. And so having all that information, does that make a difference in the performance? Does it make a difference in any way? I don't know. I mean, it would be hard to really kind of implement a model like that. And then this, to really evaluate the outcome of that, it's really hard. But I think that obviously there's a reason why, I mean, it's not that there's a reason why we have bodies, it's a reason why, we kind of, well, sort of entangle our language with the bodies that we have, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And so, yeah, it's really interesting stuff that you kind of the points that you brought up. So
yeah, and I could keep going back into those things. I will attempt to just let it be. I always think there's a certain space in this discussion that I just continue. I was fascinated with, that has to do with where to draw the lines, and how much, it feels to me that there's a rigor, there's a more holistic framework that exists, that's a truer perspective but is less tenable. And I don't know, I think it's a little bit of chasing the idea of a unicorn as well. Like, I don't know that the perspective will be fully attained or fleshed out, where you kind of have the telluric level planetary all the way through, this more like appropriate designations of like historical and development and cultural like things, almost like maybe this is a totally rough idea, telluric at planetary scale, teleonomic in the Krakauer complexity, a gentle symmetry breaking sense, decision making sense, and then other things, and then more conventional, less complex systems. Okay, and maybe that's the direction to go in, and there, I know there's something somewhat to those ends, but it's always this matter of like where you gonna do it, and how convenient or tenable is it to communicate from that standpoint. Like that's there's a certain intellectual honesty, and then maybe dishonesty and like cognitive dissonance to say, well, anything beyond this point is hard to talk about. And for the reductionists, they're like, nope, it's here. And for the people that are more anti-reductionist, no, it's got to be this here. But I don't think there's really a true. I don't think there's a true. And I'm saying the word true, which is kind of funny. I don't think there's. I haven't really seen a really holistic, a properly holistic take on it yet, and I don't know if it exists or can exist. Which is sort of I'm just basking in the paradox of that right now. So we could spend the rest of the day on this. We can move on, but I appreciate the discussion for this, and come back to it as we always do.
Okay, it sounds great. Let's see what we have in the chat here. So, Morgan posted a Frontiers paper. All right, yeah, Morgan posted a Frontiers paper. Let me pull that up. This is an image of the Acoustoelectric imaging, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the next link is the full article.
Okay.
But that was just to give you a graphic there for the.
So this is acoustoelectric brain imaging with different conductivities and acoustic distributions. So this is Frontiers in Physiology from 2023. So this is just describing the method, correct?
Yeah, this is a bit more advanced. I would say like it seemed to be in the air in 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
These things have fads too. But they're getting at this issue of some of the earlier work was based on spherical head models and idealized dipoles and things like that. And they're getting at some of the issues like, okay, none of those things really exist. We can't use spherical cows to do this,
right? Yeah.
And so what are we looking at? But a nice overview of what it would look like in practice. It is very promising. Like again, like I worry about the how to get past the focused ultrasound stage where you sort of want to do things in the magnet. I mean, in an MRI, so that you can actually see how much pressure you're getting from in a particular subject, given their particular skull and things like that. But it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, it's great. We have OpenEPhys, which is the openephiz.org, and then
that's the system that I was talking about. It's an open source device or open hardware device, and it is widely used and is part of what the Allen Institute is using as their platform for OpenScope. So you can get one of these things, play with it, and potentially, submit an application to have Allen Institute collect data from animals using, their fancy probes and etc. But you can work with it, and it's very reasonably priced. For that many channels of that sampling rate.
Yeah,
is what's particularly cool. And then a funny picture of the kernel. If you see the kernel helmet, it's I think that's a very funny guy wearing that. If you look on the website for what they call the dev kit, I think that's actually a bit more. It is also a modular device, and the dev kit gives you a sense of what's under the hood, so to speak, in that helmet.
yeah, because it's just kind of like looks like a motorcycle helmet.
It does.
Yeah,
it does. Well, I was thinking of like which of the characters in, like, is it Mario Kart or something? Like it sort of looks like a motorcycle helmet, but it sort of doesn't. You know what I mean? Like, anyway, I'll try and find a picture of the cartoon character. I think.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's great. All right, so let's go to a few readings on something called compositionality. So we've talked about, I guess compositionality is important in both like language and language models, and then also in sort of generalized learning and how we put together things in the world, or we put together things behaviorally. And so we're going to go through a few readings and get a handle on this topic. So this is the first, this is some sort of ebook article. This is from the Oxford Handbook on Compositionality. And this is an article, The Case for Compositionality, by Zhou. And so this is, I guess, a more cognitive science take on this, or a philosophical take. So it's very linguistics oriented. So we'll be talking about linguistics. I'm not going to, as someone who's not a linguist, and linguistics being pretty jargon laden and very, linguistics is part of cognitive science. But oftentimes cognitive scientists, garden variety cognitive scientists, can't penetrate everything in the linguistics literature. So just as a caveat there. So let's go over the abstract and then kind of get on with the thinking about this. So this article presents 3 more or less traditional considerations for compositionality. Okay, the first is that the usual statement of the compositionality principle is massively ambiguous. One of the 8 available readings rules out all sources of multiplicity and meaning in complex expressions besides the lexicon and the syntax. Others are more permissive. How much more is not always clear. The second claims that traditional considerations in favor of compositionality are less powerful than is often assumed. Compositionality is best construed as an empirical hypothesis on meanings expressed in natural languages. Finally, the third claim is that even if compositionality is true, most of the debates in philosophy, linguistics, and psychology surrounding compositionality will remain open. These debates tend to be about significantly stronger theses. So, kind of getting into this definition a little bit, and I don't want to spend a lot of time getting very deeply into this definition because it's a linguistic specific definition. So this is a term that kind of comes out of linguistics. So a standard theory neutral way to state the principle of compositionality is as follows. The meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its constituents and the way they are combined. So this is where we have some complex expression, and we want to think about how this gets put together. You can't just produce a complex expression de novo. You have to have some sort of way to put it together. So there, of course, a complex expression relies on meaning. That I guess maybe like the natural language speakers have to agree on the meaning. It's, sometimes it has an internal or hidden meaning. And so when you utter it, it makes sense to the other natural language speakers, and it's useful. It has some function, or it has some use. And so but you also have to put these together in some way. So you combine words. Sometimes you combine meanings. Sometimes you combine them in different ways, and you have this self-referential aspect. So maybe one way to think about this is like thinking about internet memes and how you get an internet meme that comes out of some specific context, and then it's funny, and then people keep referencing it, sometimes out of the original context. So it's just kind of known as a meme. Kind of that this is, sometimes you attach to other contexts, if you have the hot dog guy meme, I guess is a good example, where it had an original meaning in the show that it was in, and it was funny in that context, and then now people use it for any context where it's a very similar sort of situation, where someone causes a problem and then wonders who caused it. And then and then people have to agree that that's what that means, and that it's funny. But you're putting this together from other things, so you're not just kind of coming up with this in isolation. So that's the standard meaning. The principle is always understood as involving a tacit "that's all" clause. It states that the meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its constituents, the way they are combined, and nothing else besides. So this definition tacitly quantifies overexpressions of a language. It holds for most formal languages, which is no great surprise given the extent to which it facilitates meta-linguistic proofs. The question is whether we can find this nice feature in languages we did not design. And so sometimes people will use this in terms of development, in terms of acquiring language, and how that happens, and how natural language speakers acquire a language and then can build from just kind of reciting phrases or reciting words to having things that are sort of in context and other things like that. So if you think about when you learn a foreign language or a second language, you learn the vocabulary, you learn the grammatical rules, and then you have to put things together. And then once you put things together, you can understand things like slang. You can understand the context of certain phrases. I mean, there's certain phrases in English that make no sense if you're just going on vocabulary or, even grammatical rules. It make no sense. But if you have this command of the language where you can think, recombine things, put things together, and understand the context, then they make more sense. Stated in full generality, this definition is taken to be the claim that the meaning of any expression in any natural language is a function of the meanings of the constituents of that expression in that language and the way they are combined in that language. So then there are, of course, ambiguities. One complaint often voiced against the original definition that we talked about is that short of an explicit theory of meaning and a detailed set of constraints on modes of composition, it is hopelessly vague. As Barbara Partee puts it, if the syntax is sufficiently unconstrained and the meaning sufficiently rich, there seems no doubt that natural languages can be described compositionally. Challenges to the principle generally involve either explicit or implicit arguments to the effect that it conflicts with other well-motivated constraints on syntax and or on the mapping from syntax to meaning. So the original definition then in that, considering that, is typically some sort of rough statement of compositionality. Okay. And so they make this case for compositionality, and then there's this sort of weaker definition that emerges. And that weaker definition is if a complex expression has only meaningful constituents, then its meaning is a function of the meanings of its constituents and the way they are combined. Okay. So if you have a complex expression with a lot of parts, then the meaning boils down to sort of the function of what those meanings are, and then they're combined in different ways. So let's see. Russell famously denied that quantifying phrases have meaning. So for him, this new definition, or the C0 prime, came out as vacuously true for sentences involving such expressions. A quantifying phrase like an ambassador is associated with a semantic rule that specifies what larger expressions mean that contain it as a constituent. So if you say, I am an ambassador for my brand, or I am an ambassador for my country, versus this is a car called the Ambassador, or there are different ways you can use the term that have, different meanings, and you can combine them so you can kind of make an analogy between two different meanings of ambassador and things like that. When we have more than one quantifying phrase, there's a question as to what order the rules are to be applied, and depending on this order, we may end up with different meanings. This is how scope and ambiguities arise, and of course, so how many rules are applied, and then there are a lot of ambiguities in doing that have to be resolved. And so then we have this claim that is formally analogous to C0, or the original definition, and that is the physical properties of an ordinary object are a function of the physical properties of its parts and the way they are combined. So if we think about this, not just in terms of like linguistics, a linguistic definition, but we kind of think about this in terms of maybe objects in the world. Or like something that is a complex object. This ordinary object has physical properties. This is a function of the parts and the way they are combined. So it's not just that you can take, say, like a broom or a watch, and just kind of break it down into its component parts and describe them and then put them back together. You know, you have to think about, you can build a model of a watch, but if you change some of the components, or if you put things back together a different way, then, and maybe it's still recognizable as a watch. It might not be functional as a watch, but it doesn't change its identity just because you change some of the features. You may change its function, but not its identity. And so, with language, you're kind of building up concepts. So it's like you have a broom and you can break the broom down into its components, like a handle or bristles or whatever. And you can put those back together as a broom. You can put those back together as something else as well. And so that's kind of what they're getting at here. So in terms of intelligence, or in terms of intelligent systems, compositionality is both a linguistic thing where there's a communication aspect, but it's also sort of a perceptual thing where you're combining things together and you're building a model of objects, a model of the world. So then kind of gets into function. Among the various meanings of the word function, dictionaries tend to distinguish between one that indicates a dependency relation, which means that something has to be in place for something to function, or that you do something and that causes something else, or something like that. So there's a dependency relation. And then, of course, there is a mathematical function which does not do that. That's a different type of function. The construction is a function of is most naturally taken in the former sense, meaning that there's this dependency relation, but can perhaps be understood in the latter as well. So you could, in terms of, say, something is a function of something else, that maybe that implies a dependency relation. So my fist is a function of punching your face or something like that. Water is a function of plant growth or something like that. You could have that, or you could have a mathematical function that describes something, like a continuous function that describes the shape of a plant and its growth, or a mathematical function, a continuous function that describes your deformed face, or that process of punching someone in the face. I don't mean to be like cheeky about this, but I'm just trying to think of examples. So that's kind of the idea here. And then when we say the height is a function of age, among other things, we tend to read this as something stronger than the bland claim that there's a function from age to height or other things to height. So, we say, okay, I don't know why, height is a function of age is I guess when you're in development, when you're growing, you get taller as you age until you reach adulthood. But then, that's kind of a weak statement because it doesn't really, it describes the dependency relation, perhaps. But it may not be a dependency relation. It just might be something that is sort of covariating or correlated and doesn't have any real functional meaning. This is one of the problems with thinking about function in general, is that, again, we ascribe things to functions, like we observe two things changing together, and we ascribe a function to that. But it may be a spurious function or a spurious relationship, and so the function is not really there. There are things, of course, in this relationship, age is like a proxy for other things that are going on, right? It's growth, it's other things. But we use age because we can observe age more readily than we can observe like a growth process within the body. So, there are a lot of things that go on there in terms of as a function of. The meaning of a complex expression, so we need to distinguish between the following two principles. Okay, so the meaning of a complex expression is determined by of the meanings of its constituents and the way they are combined. So that's the first. And then the second is there is a function to the meaning of complex expressions from the meanings of their constituents and of the way they are combined. So there's this idea that you have a function versus it's determined by that function, basically. Or it's determined by, So there's a deterministic aspect, and then there's a possibilistic aspect. So that's another thing we need to think about. The first of these entails the second, but not the other way around. So if something is determined by something, it's part of that possibility space. And so, you have to, something has to be possible in order for it to be deterministic. But of course, if it's possible, then it doesn't imply determinism. So that's just kind of what they're getting at with this. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next paper. So this is a paper, The Compositionality of Neural Networks, Integrating Symbolism and Connectionism. So this is where we get into like neural networks and how neural networks can generalize in a way that's called compositionally. So we're moving from like kind of linguistics, hardcore linguistics, and some of the definitions involved there, to this form of compositionality in neural networks, which is putting together concepts. So this is more of the perceptual aspect of this. Okay, so the abstract reads, despite a multitude of empirical studies, little consensus exists on whether neural networks are able to generalize compositionally. A controversy that, in part, stems from a lack of agreement about what it means for a neural model to be compositional. So what they mean by generalized compositionally is very similar to what we have in language, which means you acquire things, you then put them together in a certain order that makes sense, and then that's the behavior. That's the complex behavior. It's not necessarily reductionist, but it does require like you to learn things, to acquire information, and then from that information put it together in a way that generates some behavioral output. So, you could have like, you could think about motor control as a compositional process where you learn different movements, you learn how to control your movements, and you do this in a way that's sort of like if you're learning how to ride a bike, or sometimes when you learn a martial art, you usually learn the different movements. You try to learn those things sort of, one at a time, or you try to perfect your technique, and then you go into a performance mode where you apply those movements and you try to refine them and you combine the things that you've learned. And so some of this, of course, you might be saying, is expertise. So you have to practice to get good to be able to be compositional. Same holds with language. You have to be good at you have to have a certain level of expertise with that language that you're trying to speak to be compositional. And to that, I would say, yes, that's an aspect of that. But that's not exactly what they're talking about here. So they kind of break out this compositionality from expertise. They break out compositionality from the acquisition of any specific thing. So, it might be easier to be compositional about like internet memes versus like, some dense textual reading, So yeah, it's going to depend on the context. Okay, so what does it mean for a neural model to be compositional? We don't really have a good way of thinking about that. No one's agreed on that. But we know that it's important for, say, a neural network to put together concepts, to put together words, to put together things that, so we can generalize. So if you, especially in the case of a neural network, you're training it on exemplars Those exemplars don't represent the entire world. They represent sort of vignettes of the world or cases in the world. And then what you're asking the neural network to do is to generalize to new contexts, to find slight variations. Okay, it's not exactly like the input data, but it's similar, so it belongs to this category rather than that category. It's putting together all these things, these pieces of evidence, and it needs to kind of come up with an answer. So that's kind of what it means to be compositional. But in terms of like what it actually means, we're not quite sure, or how it actually happens. So as a response to this controversy, we present a set of tests that provide a bridge between, on the one hand, the vast amounts of linguistics and philosophical theory about compositionality, and on the other, the successful neural models of language. So they're focusing on language. They're focusing on sort of these definitions that we were talking about earlier, and then also kind of what neural models are actually able to do. We collect different interpretations of compositionality and translate them into 5 theoretically grounded tests that are formulated on a task-independent level. In particular, we provide tests to investigate 5 things. The first is if models systematically recombine known parts and rules. So models can extract features, they can extract rules about the world, and they have to put them together in some way that makes sense, or that produces a complex behavior that we might recognize as something that isn't gibberish. So that's, again, this is this analogical aspect. The model could put together something in a way very different than we do. We recognize it as like successful composition because we can understand it in context. So if I ask a neural network to put together a new internet meme, and it takes like a database of internet memes and it puts together like this meta meme, it doesn't mean anything. Does it have any resonance with the people looking at it? And at the end of the day, can it successfully combine sort of the rules of internet memes, the features of internet memes, and produce an internet meme that is on its own, resonating with a human audience? So that's number one. The models have to systematically recombine known parts and rules. Number two is the model can it extend its predictions beyond the length that they have seen in the training data? In other words, can it generalize beyond the training data? 3, if models' compositional operations are local or global. So you might have local compositional rules. It might be able to do very good at composing things locally, but not globally. And that could be in sentences. That could be, it could produce maybe part of an internet meme and then fail on the rest of it. And then number 4, if models' predictions are robust to synonym substitution, so that's specific to language. So in other words, you're changing the structure of the phrase, and can it identify when things are changed? So a lot of times when like jokes or other things, there will be some synonym that's used. Sometimes we'll use synonyms in a way that's you want to be able to you want the model to be able to recognize those kind of substitutions and maintain the integrity of that meaning. And then 5, if models favor rules or exceptions during training. In other words, can models do exception handling? Can they kind of figure out if a rule is generally true? What are the cases in which it's not true? So these are all things that are kind of what we do in human language, what we do in human composition, and then can we replicate this in a neural network? And they've broken it down on these 5 points, which I think are interesting, because they're really kind of getting at that question of what are we doing differently than a large language model? And so we're obviously doing some different things, but can we kind of demonstrate that those things, maybe if an artificial system can't do them, what those are? To demonstrate the usefulness of this evaluation paradigm, we instantiate these 5 tests on a highly compositional data set called PCFG set. So I don't know, that's an acronym for something, I don't know what it means. But anyways, with this data set, they apply the resulting tests to 3 popular sequence-to-sequence models. So these are language models, a recurrent, a convolutional based, and a transformer model. So they have a recurrent model, a convolution-based model, and a transformer model. And these are sequence-to-sequence models. So these aren't large language models, but they're language models that can't, do translations of sequences. We provide an in-depth analysis of these results that uncover the strengths and weaknesses of these 3 architectures and point to potential areas of improvement. So they're doing this sort of thing called distributional semantics. And so the advancements of distributional semantics of the word level allowed the field of natural language processing to move from discrete mathematical methods to models that use continuous numerical vectors. References here. Such continuous vector representations operationalize the distributional semantic hypothesis, stating that semantically similar words have similar contextual distributions. So you have, words that are semantically similar, they produce these similar contextual distributions. And we want to do this in language models because we have a lot of words that we're trying to deal with, a lot of potential contexts, and we want to be able to then take all of that training data and not only put it, regurgitate it, but put it together in new ways. So given that we have these contextual distributions that are similar to sort of words in context, words embedded in surrounding words, they can then act as surrogates for word meaning and be used, for example, to quantify the degree of semantic similarity between words by means of simple geometric operations. Words represented in this way can be an integral part of the computational pipeline and have proven to be useful in almost all natural language processing tasks. So what they're saying is basically what we want to do is we want to be able to extract, words and word context from training data. We want to create this latent space that we can then draw from and build compositional models from, or compose things from that latent space. Okay, so that's that paper. And then the third paper is this paper, Break It Down, Evidence for Structural Compositionality in Neural Networks. So the abstract of this paper, though modern neural networks have achieved impressive performance in both vision and language tasks, we know little about the functions that they implement. One possibility is that neural networks implicitly break down complex tasks into subroutines, implement modular solutions of these subroutines, and compose them into an overall solution to a task. So this is something they call structural compositionality. So this is a hypothesis about what neural networks are doing to do compositionality. They're taking these complex tasks, if you ask it to do like compose a meme, which is not something that you can do in one step. They need to break that down into a set of subroutines. What do I do first? What do I do second? Then they need to figure out different solutions of these subroutines and then produce an overall solution by composing different parts of this, different solutions, different subroutines together. So this is structural compositionality. It's different, of course. We discussed function before and sort of how that works in language. So there's this functional compositionality. This is structural compositionality. Another possibility is that they may simply learn to match new inputs to learn templates, eliding test decomposition entirely. So this is another hypothesis a competing hypothesis which says we don't really need to do compositionality. This is something humans do. An easier way to do this is to just have a bunch of templates and match the inputs to those templates. So, I mean, this, you could even argue that humans actually do this. We don't really, we kind of, this is why I did the first paper first, because compositionality, you can see evidence of this in linguistics. People have developed this on natural language, how you have these sort of rules of compositionality. You have this process of compositionality. You need to put together words in a natural language. But it could also be that humans just simply use different templates that we, kind of fit the data to. So we have these huge number of mental models. We get data, we fit it into a mental model, store it away, and then compare the mental models. That's probably not how human cognition works. But if you think about like how neural networks do it, we have these two competing hypotheses where we either need compositionality, which is a way to sort of recombine things. So we don't have to, say, rely on one standard template or the best template or a series of things. We just simply kind of put things together, or the neural network puts things together as it encounters things. Those kinds of models are robust to error, they're robust to exceptions, and they're very good at handling linguistic data, but also for other types of perception as well. And so these are the two hypotheses. Here we leverage model pruning techniques to investigate this question in both vision and language across a variety of architectures, tasks, and pre-training regimes. So they're looking at not just language, but also in vision, which are just, training data or training models on visual data or images. And so, in vision, of course, you're segmenting images. You're not building a linguistic model, but you're just taking those features and you're doing something to the features, you're classifying them, you're building some sort of latent space, and then you're putting things together just like you would in language. And so, it's going to be different. And of course, you can have a model that combines vision and language, which we've seen in past meetings. And so, we want to see if compositionality is the same in both modalities. We also want to see if compositionality is something that's required in an artificial model. Our results demonstrate that models often implement solutions to subroutines via modular subnetworks. Again, this is like the last paper, which can be ablated while maintaining functionality of other subnetworks. So again, we have modular subnetworks. The benefit of that is that they're sort of have this redundancy. They have this robustness where you can ablate one modular subnetwork and it doesn't collapse the entire representational structure, doesn't collapse the function of the network. So it's interesting how they can thought about this. This suggests that neural networks may be able to learn compositionality, obviating the need for specialized symbolic mechanisms. So that's what they're doing here. So we don't know with neural networks, we don't know about the functions that they learn to implement, which means that we don't know how they build these complex outputs. We don't know how they build these complex behaviors. In particular, there is a debate over the role of compositionality, which has been touted as a key property of human cognition, enabling humans to exhibit flexible and abstract language processing and visual processing, among other cognitive processes. So if you want some other references on compositionality and its relevance to broader context of cognitive science, Gary Marcus, back in the days when he was doing linguistics, wrote something on this. Piantadosi, of course, as we know from cognitive science, wrote something on this. Lake, Smolensky, And those are some of the people who have written on this. According to common definitions, Quilty, Dunn, Fodor, and Lepore, a representational system is compositional if it implements a set of discrete constituent functions that exhibit some degree of modularity. So we need to have sort of these discrete functions, and we need to have modularity. And so modularity is where you take things and they're in these like modules. They're basically units, subunits that, so you have a bunch of subunits that compose a larger unit. And so you have things that are not, they're not all interconnected without structure. The modular structure usually means that they're like, clusters of things and they're divided out functionally. So you might have a module for, the thing with Fodor, he used to think about cognitive modules. So different areas of the brain would do different things and they would kind of come together as cognitive function, but you had certain parts of the brain that would do certain things, specialize in certain things. And so you can think about, function in, say, neural networks as modular. So different concepts are embedded in different locations, different shapes, different variations are embedded in different locations, and so on. So one example of this is how blue circle is represented compositionally, that a system is able to entertain the concept blue independently of circle, and vice versa. So you can have blue circle, you can have red circle, you can have green circle, you can have blue square. And so blue is this module that connects to circle, it connects to square, and then circle is a module that connects to green, and I guess I said red. So you can have different colors, you can have different shapes, and they're all units that are sort of interconnected. And so if you want to know, if a machine wants to know what a blue circle is, or how to represent a blue circle, then it has to reference that blue module and then that circle module, and they're put together compositionally. And you could ablate the blue module and still have a circle. You can't have a blue circle, but you could still have a circle. So that's what they mean by when you ablate something, you maintain the functionality of other subnetworks. You don't ablate the entire concept of blue circle. You just ablate the idea of a blue circle. You can have circles of other colors. And in fact, if you had, you could probably approximate blue in some way. So that, that's something that you could do compositionally. It is an open question as to whether neural networks require explicit symbolic mechanisms to implement compositional solutions, or whether they implicitly learn to implement compositional solutions during training. So, do we need to hard code symbolic mechanisms into the model, or can we just have it learn these symbolic mechanisms? This may seem trivial, but think about like human cognition, which we talked about with linguistics, where you sort of learn a language, you learn sort of the stuff first, the words, the rules, and then you learn the symbolic mechanisms. Not as like, you don't learn the symbols, you don't learn the meanings necessarily directly. You acquire the meanings through interaction by using the language, by interacting with other people, use the language, and then you get this notion of symbolism. You learn some basic symbolism, like you might learn that, like a star means this or that, but they're deeper symbolic mechanisms that you don't have to learn explicitly. So in other words, you don't necessarily have to hard code them into a model or train a model for symbolic sort of behavior. Historically, artificial neural networks have been considered non-compositional systems, instead solving tasks by matching new inputs to learn templates. So this goes back to sort of this idea that, artificial neural networks have to be trained and they reflect the training data and they don't really do anything outside of that. So this is not something that's native to neural networks. You have to have a way to build a neural, compositionality in a neural network. So neural networks by themselves, in the native version, have this sort of lack of compositionality. And so this has served as a key point in favor of integrating explicit symbolic mechanisms into contemporary artificial intelligence systems. So having this symbolic layer, and there's this whole idea of neurosymbolic models. So we have the neural model and then the symbolic model. And you can combine those, and the reason that people do that is not just to make the output behavior look more human, but because that gives you this compositionality that allows you to do things, generate things that are maybe more human-like, but definitely gives you this functional flexibility. Okay. However, modern neural networks with no explicit inductive bias towards compositionality have demonstrated success on increasingly complex tasks. This raises the question, are these models succeeding by implementing compositional solutions under the hood? So maybe these models aren't explicitly compositional, but maybe they do some sort of thing that approximates compositionality, and it works just as well. So they have three contributions here. The first is we introduced the concept of structural compositionality, which characterizes the extent to which neural networks decompose compositional tasks into subroutines and implement them modularly. We test for structural compositionality in several different models across both language and vision. So they want to look at structural compositionality like they did in the first paper. They want to understand how that works. We discover that surprisingly, there is substantial evidence that many models implement subroutines in modular subnetworks, though most do not exhibit perfect task decomposition. So there is maybe some limited compositionality in neural networks, and they don't exhibit perfect task decomposition. So the whole process, just in a neural model and not a symbolic model, is maybe a little bit off. And so maybe a symbolic model helps achieve sort of human levels of compositionality. So if you think about, like, people talk about human levels of performance, we also have human levels of compositionality. So, number three is we characterize the effect of unsupervised pre-training on structural compositionality in fine-tuned networks, and find that pre-training leads to a more consistently compositional structure in language models. So you could have pre-training on structural compositionality. This isn't creating templates, but this is sort of an intermediate strategy where you give it some information about structural compositionality, and it's better at it, not surprisingly. So I'm going to finish off with this last paragraph. This study contributes to the emerging body of work on mechanistic interpretability, which seeks to explain the algorithms that neural networks implicitly implement within their weights. So they actually have, like, you have the weight structure in a neural network, but there are other things going on, the consequences of those weight structures. We make use of techniques from model pruning in order to gain insight into these algorithms. While earlier versions of these techniques have been applied to study modularity in a multitask setting, our work is novel in that it applies the method to more complex language and vision models, studies more complex compositional tasks, and connects the results to a broader discussion about defining and measuring compositionality within neural networks. So this was presented at NeurIPS in 2023. Okay, so that's all I have on that topic, on compositionality. I know we kind of went from hardcore linguistics into sort of cognitive science, and then at the end I put the cognitive science in context. Morgan, you look like you're ready to say something.
No, it's a super important concept. Yeah, and those are different aspects, but yeah. Not sure I have something at this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. Compositionality, I think, is really useful for also for embodiment as well, because you're in embodiment, you have a body that is developing, and then if you're thinking about developmental psychology, you have a body that's developing, it's growing, it's and then you have language, you're learning language at the same time, and then there's this sort of, or perceiving things at the same time, and so there's this sort of putting things together, but in the context of a grow, something that's always a body, it's always changing, a world that's always changing as you learn more about it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot there. And so, I mean, we can see what that means to be compositional, right? It's that you start with like this baseline of knowledge. It might be like acquiring a bunch of knowledge in a training set, and then being able to put things together in terms of cognition. So it's not automatic that a model can reason, or it can put things out there that are complex, except for regurgitating things.
Mm-hmm.
So if I query a large language model, I could ask it a question. It could might not be able to give me an answer because I didn't basically lead it with the question. So it has to put together things from different places, and then but put them together in a way that makes sense. And then that's not really reasoning, but it's enough to like make statements that one that follows the other, that follows the other. And so this is part of when we talked about reasoning in large language models, we might want to back up and think more about the compositionality aspect as well, and how that leads outward to reasoning.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up the tomorrow. There's going to be a journal club from the Cortical Labs Journal Club. Right? So this is the company making the bioreactors. They're going to have, I believe, though, it's not really a journal club. Like it's going to be a presentation.
Yeah.
From somebody at Hopkins. I'm not sure, it's student, postdoc. Excuse me. Talking about spatial maps.
Okay.
And I think of that just in terms of some people talking about are again in the context of kind of cognitive development, that our motor control system becomes this not quite foundation, but certainly seems can be seen as part of compositional component to other systems after that, in a developmental context. So I'll see how much he covers in that. It's supposed to be kind of like a wide range of neural spatial, but I'll see how much compositionality comes into that.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, it's interesting. The motor control people also talk a lot about composition, like like when you're putting together sequences of sub movements, and you put it together into a whole movement, and it's very similar to the linguistic context. And then of course there's the whole idea of like language and movement and how those are related.
It comes up a lot in the meta papers, just the recent ones that were focused on typing.
Okay.
Right, like speech. I should say the meta speech decoding, right, which were very much not speech but actually typing.
Yeah.
But the accompanying paper was on hierarchical language models, or how, again, because they were looking at typing, they got to kind of see the units of the motor activity.
Yeah.
Very, very much the units. But in the longer time context, they could see the larger units. Yeah. building up into sentences and things like that. Anyway, yeah, I think about William James, of course, talking about pianists, but as well as like the problem of how does the pianist do it? They seem to be caching things in their fingers.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that again kind of speaks to what training allows you to do, and being able to put together and start to play things by sight, or play things without the music, and then to actually improvise. Right?
Oh yeah. Great example. Yeah. All right. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for attending. Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye. See you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.